Another issue is the lost Gospels. People sometimes raise the question of the lost Gospels. However, the lost Gospels, that's a misnomer. They weren't lost. They were mostly discarded. But anyway, the four Gospels, if you look at early canon lists, the four Gospels were unanimously accepted in the earliest canon lists, with the exception of Marcion, who was considered very eccentric. And that was across the Roman Empire. This is already in the 2nd century. All Christians were accepting the Gospels except for Marcion. That's from France, Irenaeus, to Syria, Tatian. They were accepting the four Gospels. There were canonical disputes, but they didn't involve the Gospels, and they're therefore not relevant to what we're talking about here. Of 40 ancient canon lists, only one mentioned any Gospel other than these four. And that was the Gospel of Thomas. So the vast majority, 95 or more percent, accepted these four and only these four. In terms of lost Gospels, well, what we call Gospels from the ancient world are of two kinds. One refers to what we call apocryphal Gospels. These come from the heyday of novels in antiquity, the late 2nd and early 3rd century. And they're novels. Now, I have nothing against novels. If you like to read novels, it's fine. You can read the apocryphal Gospels. They're novels. But to say that the apocryphal Gospels are giving you reliable information about Jesus, they don't have the same kind of Galilean and Judean information. Novelists in antiquity didn't care normally about going back and getting the historical details correct. And the apocryphal Gospels don't care about going back and getting the historical details correct. The Gnostic Gospels are a different story. They're not exactly novels. They're a different genre, mainly of sayings. Nothing wrong, again, with a collection of sayings. Proverbs is a collection of sayings. Matthew's Logia may have been a collection of sayings. There's debate about that, of course. But what we have in the Gnostic Gospels are Gnostic elements from the 2nd century or later. None of these are from the 1st century. The Gospel of Thomas is the earliest, probably, of these, probably the most likely to contain any genuine information about Jesus. But how do we know which information in it is genuine? Well, where it agrees with our 1st century sources. The Gospel of Thomas is usually dated to the mid-2nd century. One scholar, Nicholas Perrin, has argued for its dependence on the Diatessaron, making it as late as 170. But even if it's the mid-2nd century, we're talking about almost a century after when most scholars date the Gospel of Mark. And Thomas is the earliest of our non-canonical Gospels. The others are all much later. But even Thomas, which includes the most likely traces of Jesus' sayings, has Gnostic elements, a kind of Gnosticism that isn't documented until the 2nd century. Contrary, again, to what some earlier scholars have said, Edwin Yamauchi has laid that case to rest. And most scholars today, following Yamauchi, following Wilson, following other scholars, if you go back and look at the evidence, most of the material is much later than that. Some people have argued for other lost Gospels. One scholar has argued that Q is a lost Gospel. But the problem with that is that scholars have been talking about Q for over a century. It's not lost. It's hypothetical and reconstructed. And the way that scholar reconstructs it is even more hypothetical. But some scholars have gone even further. Some have said, okay, well, we're not going to depend on the canonical Gospels. We'll depend on the secret Gospel of Mark, as opposed to the Gospel of Mark that's in the canon. The secret Gospel of Mark is a very short text. And it's interesting with relation to its discovery. There was a novel where Lord Morton discovered a subversive manuscript at a certain monastery. Well, it was 1 year after that Morton Smith went to that very monastery and discovered a manuscript. Some scholars who have examined it have noticed traces of a forger's tremor and Smith's Greek style. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily Smith forged the document, but clearly it's not an authentic document. Somebody forged the document. doesn't necessarily have to be Smith. It portrays Jesus as a gay magician using a 20th century Western understanding of homosexuality that didn't exist in the first century. It includes some 20th century dirty jokes and has been used by some scholars as if it were a pre-Gospels source. But many scholars now believe that it's a 20th century forgery. And in any case, it's not from the first century. The manuscript that Smith believed he discovered is from the 19th century. What was from the 19th century? The manuscript has somehow disappeared. Was from the 19th century. And this manuscript was a copy of something that supposedly went back to the late 2nd century. So it's nothing that goes back to the 1st century in any case. So when people talk about the lost Gospels, they are really dealing with things that are not really good sources. If you want to know about Jesus, the sources that the church has in the 4 Gospels are the best sources to work with. Now, I say this as somebody who would really love it if we found some more 1st century sources. It would be great for historical work. But we don't have any other, except a snippet here and this historian, a snippet there and that historian, that don't add anything to what we already know from the Gospels. But I'm glad that the canon is not longer than it is anyway, because when I have to teach New Testament in one semester, I'd never get through it if we had more Gospels than the 4. But I still would like it if we discovered some other things.